Hey YouTube, welcome back to a monster video that's been a while in the making. I came up with this idea during a long sleepless night, and I actually think it's quite interesting. I own way too many bass trombones right now, and luckily I happen to own instruments from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and a couple modern horns as well. And so I actually have instruments that represent a bunch of different steps along the way, from not bass trombone instruments before this all the way to what we have now. And I thought it'd be really cool to demonstrate and show all the differences of these instruments. The design of bass trombone is a history of compromise, right? Let's see how the compromises slowly go away or replaced with different compromises as we go through that history. This is only snapshots, of course. I don't own every tiny iteration on the way from straight trombone, sack, but whatever, all the way up to modern shires. But I have some important snapshots that give us good ideas of those steps, at least in the United States, of course. I'm only talking about American bass trombones. I'm not going to get into world bass trombone history. So why are there compromises? And so many of them, compared to other instruments that existed in the same time period in the last 100 years, why are there so many compromises we have to make with bass trombone? And that is entirely, well, almost entirely, down to chromaticism. The tenor trombone is chromatic for the range that it needs to play in. Low E to as high as you can play. There are no missing notes. And that's actually what sets trombone apart from its brass instrument brethren up until the existence of valves. It was the only chromatic brass instrument. The problem is composers kept writing lower notes. They kept wanting lower things. Low C and low B started to show up more and more in third trombone, bass trombone parts in orchestra music. The tenor bass trombone, B flat trombone with an F valve, did exist for a while before we considered the bass trombone to exist, but they kept adding lower and lower notes. So we needed to have a chromatic range below the range that we already had. And this movement from just asking for singular notes here and there, a random low B, a random low C, really moved to requiring way more facility in the lower register and adding lots of notes all the way down to the pedals, which is kind of two separate things. We first start with just adding a couple low notes. You can think of something like Mahler 6 is actually quite exceptional in it, that it requires a lot of really big low playing. That's almost an example of the second kind, which is just being like, well, if you can play low C and low B, why can't you just play anything that's in the low range? And those compromises required to do that show up in our instruments. I think that's very interesting. So let's take a tour, starting with this. So our first instrument up on the docket is my Conn 70H. I actually just looked up the serial number. It said 1952, much earlier than I thought. I thought it was 1955. Doesn't really matter. The 70H did change a lot from the 30s. I think they started making the 70H, maybe the 20s, all the way up until the 60s. At some point they stopped making 70H. It changed a few times, but this is a pretty good example, kind of representative example of the 70H. We got bronze tubes, nickel crook, yellow bell, yellow F attachment. It's kind of normal for a 70H. This is a completely compromised instrument. And by compromise, I mean, say you want to design a trombone and you want it to be easy to hold and just kind of logical and everything lines up intonation-wise and it's going to fit in most cases. There's a lot of stuff you just kind of want to work out. And a lot of tenor trombones, especially straight tenor trombones, they get to do all of that. There's no compromises they have to make. You have to be able to reach 7th position, and it has to be in tune, it has to sound good. It's kind of it. When they designed the 70H, however, they had to compromise so many things because of that chromaticism we talked about in the opening segment. This has been completely massaged in every single way so that we can play low C without taking this out at all, and we can play low B when we pull it all the way out. And there are so few instruments that have to make, they have to like completely change their design in order to do that. 70H, it's one of the very obvious examples of that. So looking at the slide length of this slide, let's compare it to a kind of typical Bach length slide. We get to listen to some singing today, which is beautiful. And we can see here, if I hold these so that they're both the same length, you can see the 70H slide is incredibly longer, like an inch plus longer than this Holton slide, which is kind of Bach 50 length, which is pretty long. Most slides are not this long these days. This is, again, and I have the tuning slide out, or the tuning and slide out just a little bit on the 70H. It is that much longer than a 50 length slide. And compared to like an Edwards, it's like straight up 2 inches longer. And guess what? That gets you more slide on the end, and you can play something like a low C in 7th position. Let's actually test that real quick. So most trombones, and I've demonstrated this before in videos, can't do that. You try and play, especially tuned to F, you try to play a low C in 7th position. I'm using a valve and obviously playing it up an octave, but that way we can hear the intonation more easily. Most horns can't do that, but this has so much slide left on the end that you just easily can. One of those compromises made is that the F attachment is tuned a little bit flat, and then this has springs in the slide so that if you want to play a low F, you can bring it all the way in. Instead of the opposite, like most horns now, where you tune to an F, and if you need to play a C, you move the slide out a little bit. They massaged even just that little bit of length out of the F attachment. So in order to play low F, not flat, I need to all the way up against, well, not even corks, because there aren't any. We get that noise instead. But we compress the springs all the way to first. So again, we can play low C all the way in the end of the slide without pulling anything, without moving anything. Putting 2 valves on an instrument, not really an idea yet. That had been done in Germany, I believe, at this point, on contrabass trombones and maybe even a couple of bass trombones. In the US in 1952, and when this was originally designed in the 30s, I don't think that had been done at all yet. I'm probably wrong. There's probably someone out there with pictures of something, but it was not common. I don't think Conn even had the inkling of an idea of putting 2 valves on a trombone. That was just like, why would you put 2 valves on it? Instead, you can design an entire instrument around playing 2 notes and do that instead. So one of the other compromises, we'll talk about one of them first. Long slide means if you have a regular length bell section like this, the bells are in the same spot right there. We can put it like this to make it a little more obvious. If you have a regular length bell section, then you're just going to be flat. You're not going to have, you have too much tubing. You have like 9.5 feet of tubing instead of 9 feet. And so the 70H bell section is really short. Again, it's not super obvious right there, but the Holton, which is regularly kind of proportioned, sticks out like this much farther behind the 70H. So again, another weird compromise. This changes a lot of things and is the main reason why this is slide tuning and not bell tuning like most modern instruments. Another compromise that is not necessarily a compromise really, but this pull on the F attachment wrap is insanely long. Okay, I'm gonna pull, I'm pulling. Okay, there's the mark for E tuning. There's a mark on the slide right there, which is pretty handy, so you can pull it out to there. That's low E. So there's a low E. That gives us a much more accessible low C. It's not all the way at the end of the slide. It's kind of just a little bit past 6th. Pretty handy. But I have more pull. How much more pull do I have? Right about there is where a Bach 50 slide would fall out. Right there is kind of where you'd last want to end. This is an insane amount of tuning slide pull for an F attachment. Like, I don't think there are any other instruments on the planet that have this much. And of course, most modern ones, you don't need it. You have 2 valves where you play tenor trombone or something. Like, this doesn't even fit on the screen. This sticks out so far. This gives us flat E, almost E flat. So that's basically halfway between E and E flat. If I want to play an E flat, that's how far I am out from first position. That is just, it's like playing a high G. Just a little bit gives me an E. That gives us low B. I'm using the same position right there. I'm putting the slide 7th. I'm putting down the valve, and it's the same. There are almost no instruments where you can do that. Just play a low B on one valve. That is incredible. It's very kind of cool that you can create an instrument to do this. It just is unnecessary now. We've moved past this. So what does this get us? All this compromise. We have an instrument that is incredibly front heavy. We have an instrument that is not very facile. Like, you can play low C and low B, but if you want to play anything around them at the same time, you're going all the way back to first position for like a pedal B flat. To play a scale, for instance, if you have this in flat E and you want to play a B flat major scale or like A major scale, you can't play E in second position anymore, or even first. You have to play it in 7th. That's your only choice. The compromises are crazy just to play those couple notes. And it really shows that at this point, those notes are being written. People are asking for low C and low B, but they're not asking for facility in those registers. Not nearly as often. They're going, here's a low C. If you want to play Heldenleben, now you can play ba 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 da ba ba ba. You can play a low C. If you need to play a low B, maybe Concerto for Orchestra, even though I wouldn't play this, they're occasionally showing up. You can play it. And a lot of times you don't need to play stuff around it. You just have to play a low B. It's a half note or something. And that's really showing up in this design. Facility, not asked for. And therefore, those compromises we're kind of willing to make. I think they're still really crazy because this instrument is so front heavy. It has such a long slide, which means there's more stuff on the slide. And there's so much less bell section that it's just incredibly front heavy. And of course, there's only one valve. One last point I want to bring up about each of these instruments is the tapers. If you look at the specs of this instrument, it's 562. I've measured it. Single bore, of course, even though there are dual bore 547, 562 versions of the 70H. This is a single bore 562, and it has a 9.5-inch bell. It has 593 valve tubing. So all those measurements you think of when you think bass trombone, you're like, yep, that's bass trombone. That's what an Edwards is. That's what a Shires is. But the rest of it is not. We need to look closer. We got to look a little more granular. Starting here, this is all so much smaller than a modern bass trombone. The Fuchs model, again, which is much larger than this, or the Bach 50, which existed largely around the same time, were way larger. And they were considered a little bit too big, probably, for a lot of settings, because the instruments around the 70H were smaller. There's a lot of people playing medium bores in orchestras as like big instruments. There's a lot of just small bores, and by small bore I mean like 485 or even smaller than that. So the instruments kind of match the 70H. The 70H did not need to be massive because the instruments around it were also not massive. If you want to think about playing with tubas are also like regular size. They were not huge horns yet, especially the mouthpieces were not very large yet. And therefore, the 70H kind of didn't have trouble keeping up. It was appropriate for the time. And we're going to talk about the evolution of that as we go through our other different horns as well. So that's a 70H So many compromises made. Very cool instrument, makes a very cool sound, but there's a reason we kind of don't need to do this these days. Let's check that out. Instrument, I can say that, I swear I can, is this 1967 or 1968, I just looked it up and I just forgot, Holton 185. Now, this is not representative of 1968 necessarily, it's actually representative of a bit earlier period. The Holton 169, I believe, came out earlier in the 1960s, and this is largely the same as that, and is analogous with, I think, the first Bach 50 B2s, the dependent F, E flat, or F, E Bach 50s. And this is a different way to get low notes. Somebody at some point, and I'm not exactly sure who, was like, hey, what about two valves? Instead of compromising everything about the instrument just to get those two notes, which are coming up more and more often, and now we're being asked to play them around other notes, and maybe they're like eighth notes or something. How about we just put another valve on this instrument? Obviously, Bach, instead of doing this, they put the second valve right here, right after the return on the F side, and they just had a separate model. And Holton was like, man, we have to design a whole new wrap for that. How about we make the same single bass trombone with a normal closed wrap, and we just throw a valve on the back of it. And that means a couple things. One, we get two valves, and two, that means you can take it off. Because a lot of the time in the music of the day, and this kind of goes for today as well, you don't need two valves. You're not going to play that many low C's, low B's. So maybe you throw this on when you got like some big low playing, and for most of the time, you take that off, you just put it in the F tuning slide, and you forget about it. You just have a single bass trombone, which is, in the 60s, largely all you need. And in orchestral repertoire especially, you're probably never going to use that second valve. This is going to be a separate thing. This originally comes in E, which I believe this is in E if I put this in all the way. So that's more like flat E, which not very useful. I'd like to pull this to E flat as it is right now and get an E flat. It's a little bit more familiar for me, but obviously not really. That's not how I play. But E flat, I think, is a little more useful. It puts the low range a little closer to the player. I could tune this exactly the same. It's probably like right there as the attachment on the 70H is on the floor next to me, and you can see how much tubing this is. Obviously, you can see it on the 70H when the slides out all the way, just how much tubing you have to add to get to flat E. And this just uses an entire valve to do it instead of the longest tuning slide of all time. Eventually, this will get changed to a D slide, I think. But this puts low C and low B much farther in, and of course with so much more facility. It's just so much easier to get to. We have different compromises now. Weight distribution, instead of being front heavy, now it's left heavy. Trying to go that way now. The instrument very much wants to rotate away from the player, because obviously we have all this weight way off the center line, way off the center axis, and it wants to go whoop like this. Stock levers, which this does not have. These have been split to a very modern style. I can't show you the originals. Are like really not very useful. It was a lever here for the F valve, and then right next to it, you would put this on the main brace, was a little removable one for the E flat valve that you would try and press down at the same time. Going between them was nearly impossible. They might have had rollers. I don't know if the Holtons had rollers. It's just not good, and there's a reason this has been split to a modern style. Those original rollers, because again, they're really thinking about, we're trying to get you low C and low B. Every once in a while, you have to play a scale or something. You don't have to have a lot of facility down there. So they really hadn't thought up of this until much later. And that, again, shows on this because this has been converted. Instead of playing through one valve, now we're playing through two valves. Even when you only play low F, you're still playing through that second valve. It's still going through this port. And so there's a compromise there because, yes, we've added 2 valves. Things are a bit easier now, but valve technology has gone nowhere. I think these valves are probably like a little better than the valve on the Conn, which is pretty small, but they're not amazing. These are not in any way a modern rotor valve. These are just like what they put on tenors, and they're like, yeah, put it on the bass. Why would we larger valves? Why would we do that? Smarter design? No. Just put on a couple of valves. Don't worry about it. And so there are definitely compromises with playing just through the F valve, and then especially adding both valves. The response, the sound are much less even than it would be on a modern instrument. And of course, even though it does less so than the 70H, this does stick out quite a lot. And this wasn't a problem in period because everyone just used stock cases, but it's really hard to find a case that fits this thing. I basically am stuck with putting this in an Altieri gig bag or one of my Cronkite gig bags. It's kind of it. You can force this into a Marcus Bonham, but I haven't done it myself. Despite all these compromises, this is still a massive step forward. There's a lot of music that if you put it in front of me and I had a 70H and this, I would choose this. Why would I choose the 70H? It is so much harder to get around the mid-low register on the 70H than it is on this. I'm not super comfortable with E-flat tuning, but I can still find a low C. I still can find a low B, and otherwise I can kind of play it as a single bass trombone. This is so much easier to get around. Obviously, I have split triggers, which the original ones did not. But even then, there's a reason the double valve bass trombone, even in dependent form with E-flat valves and like non-split triggers, those stuck around for a lot longer than something like the 70H did because it just made so much more sense with the rep of the day. Talking about dimensions again, this is a dimensional copy of a Bach 50, and so largely it's just a Bach 50, which is much larger than the previous 70H. Materials are different. They don't really matter to our discussion today, but this is really analogous to a lot of modern bass trombones. Edwards are much larger than this. There are aspects of Shires that are different, even though those are largely Bach 50 inspired as well. But there's things like the Greenhose and M&Ws have larger, lower legs on their tuning slides. But this is kind of a modern size. And a little bit why I was surprised, why I shouldn't be surprised that my Marquis 87 works so well. This works in all my Bachs. This is basically just a Bach. It's got different materials, but it shouldn't be a surprise that a modern bass trombone mouthpiece really works well in this. The 70H is much more picky, does not like to be played with anything larger than like 1 1/4 at the very top. Whereas this, I have a feeling, would work with a lot of larger mouthpieces and just be fine with it. So there have already been strides in making this size bass trombone, what we consider the modern bass trombone, at the time of the 50s was massive. By the time of this is kind of normal. This is what people expect. The instruments around us are getting larger. A lot of Conn 88Hs, maybe Bach 42s in 1968. There's not a ton of them, but they're definitely out there. There's the Holton large bores as well. They're making quite a few of them. This is matching the instruments around it by being larger and being more common. There's a lot of Holtons of this type made compared to other instruments. 70H, there's probably a fair amount of them, but there's not that many. Stuff like this in the Bach 50 are becoming much more common and readily available to the bass trombone playing public. Next horn up. Another decade has passed. We're in the 1970s. I'm not sure if it was a full decade. I'm actually not sure when this came out exactly. But it was the 1970s. We're just going by broad decades. This is an Olds S24G. Olds' first independent bass trombone, as far as I know. Please don't let there be any surprises I don't know about, because that would ruin my whole video. We've gone through having 2 valves now on the Holton 185, Bach 50B2. There's actually some, are there Olds S20 might have 2 valves? I can't remember, but there's Reynolds with dependent valves, etc. And Olds is like, why not 2 in a row? And that way you can use them at different times. You don't have to use one and then the other one. Gives you even more facility. Yay, facility. This is, again, a massive forward step in thinking about the bass trombone. We're not just trying to like barely fill out the chromatic low register. We're trying to play these notes like easily and more often. You can tell that the area that this was designed was focused a lot on commercial music, jazz band stuff, film recording, TV recording. A lot of that music is what is driving the evolution of the bass trombone in that low register. Not only in that, but in the lever placement. We finally have modern lever placement. Are they exactly where you would put modern levers? No, they are not. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is huge. We can finally use different fingers for different valves. This is something I think probably had been done on German contrabass trombones in F, because they also have to use independent valves. It hadn't been done on American instruments up until this point, I think. I don't know if this is the very first one, but it's got to be like one of the first that was designed from the factory with 2 different levers. Obviously, you can't use your thumb for an independent bass trombone just by itself, so good. They needed to do something about that. Also, something very forward-thinking is that this had exchangeable valve tunings. This is actually the F tuning slide. Let's see if I can get it out. There we go. This goes on this side if I wanted to, and this one is much shorter. There we go. And that actually goes on this side. So this can be tuned in F/G. That's how it would come from the factory. It's S24G after all. I think it goes somewhere like that. Let's check. Yeah, that's just about right. S24G, so it comes in F and G, but since these are the same span and of the length of the tuning slides, you can also get G flat tuning. So now we have multiple offerings of tuning in one instrument, which is very neat. Something the Holton 181 would do very close after this in like the mid-70s. And something that's a little more common today. You're not usually going to get both tunings in one, but having multiple offerings for tunings instead of just thinking, well, we're just trying to make the horn chromatic, so we're going to put on the shortest possible crook that gets us to low B. No, the G flat valve makes things easier in the low register, again, which is an odd thought for the 1970s. I have my script here. I'm trying to stick to it. Let's talk about these compromises, right? So the levers are on the correct fingers, but they're in the worst possible spots. So let's take the strap off here for a second, because that is hiding some of the problems. My hand wants to be about here. This lever, it's in about the right spot. This lever is not. It's pretty much where my thumb would want to be, and so I have to put my thumb way farther back. I have to basically tilt my whole hand in order to get around this. And of course, my thumb is like stuck right in the crook of this lever, not out here on the paddle where you'd kind of want to use it. It's right here because this is already offset from the brace. Really, like, yes, forward thinking in where they're placed, but also not at all. This is uncomfortable. I think that's really common in F attachment instruments from the era, and not really surprising for the 1970s. It is a bummer though, because there were better ways to put on F attachments. Even the Bach, like underslung levers and stuff from like the 50s are a better design. And also these valves are clock sprung. So instead of the spring being in the linkage like we have in almost every modern instrument and all the instruments we've seen so far, the springs are actually in the valves. If I took off this valve cap and then took off the backing plate right here, there's actually a spring in this connected to the valve that is giving us our resistance to spring back to the open position. And that's, you know, not the worst thing on the planet, but they're harder to service, they're harder to put back together, and it means we have weird linkages sometimes. So just a little bit backwards thinking. That's something common, more common on like French horns and stuff. We just don't really need that on trombone. Also, the valve size, it's hard to tell in this picture because I don't have anything to reference. But let's check out a modern rotor, such as on this M&W. There's these valves, and here's these valves. They are massively different in size. This has 585 valve tubing, which is the same size as the Holton 185. It's not small. It is smaller than most modern instruments, but it's not small. It plays very well. But these valves are very, very, very small. There's a reason the S24 and S22, yes, were upgraded to the P22 and the P24 just a few years down the line. They got much larger, much more modern valves that like radically modernized this instrument. Again, these play pretty well. I think they're not bad valves. I think that's pretty good, but they are not perfect. They get stuffy if you try to play like really, really loud. The fact that they spin different directions, they don't both go the same direction, means sometimes when you try to put like valves down, they like get in the way just a little bit. The fact that they're clock sprung means the resistance is not quite the same throughout the valve travel, which also means they're a little weird. There's a lot of things about the valves that are just like, what? Not quite right. And like a lot of these earlier instruments, 70H, I think, included, the overall length of the instrument is a little bit too long. This is just barely up to 440 when I use a Lasky 85, which is not a big mouthpiece. It is on the smaller end of modern mouthpieces, and it's like just barely up to pitch with the tuning slide all the way in. And again, that really shows the mouthpieces at the time were a lot smaller, and to get a little more room in pitch, they made the instruments a little longer because you'd probably have your tuning slide there if you're playing a 1.5 G. Again, I think this is a bit of a mistake. Box are notorious for this. They're just very long, and I have to feel like if you're playing in a cold indoor space, even with a 1.5 G, something like this or a Bach 50B is just like maybe in tune with the tuning slide all the way in. That might just be like a design problem that they baked into the very beginning and never thought about until it was too late. But having them be so long is interesting. Other brands went the other way later, but this is where we ended up. This is not a compromise per se, but these are definitely geared towards a commercial sound. Like I said, the area they were designed and used was playing a lot of music like that, and so the design really does reflect that. We got a lot of nickel, and then red brass. So that's a very kind of brighter sounding instrument probably, as well as the tapers. We have a modern width slide, quite wide, a nice big a dual radius crook, so kind of modern in a lot of ways, kind of big, but then the tuning slide span a little bit narrower, and the size through this and the bell stem is kind of in between the 70H and the Holton 185 that we've already seen. It's just a little bit smaller than we would see on modern instruments, but still totally appropriate in playing like kind of any modern music. This instrument is great. It is a really good horn. I actually extremely want to put modern valves on this because I think this could be like such a good commercial instrument. As it is, I can play it with a strap without completely ruining my hand, but it's not comfortable, and the valves are just stuffy enough that it's not really viable for everything. Otherwise, I think this would be such a cool instrument. The later P24G, which I don't have, does solve some of those issues, but the ergonomics are actually worse. So they got close, I guess. In any case, this is our step in the 70s towards a more modern bass trombone. A big step, but still not quite there. last instrument in the vintage instrument category is not quite the instrument that it should be. I'm calling this Yamaha 8130G. Of course, it is just barely one of those. Only the slide is actually from the Yamaha 8130, but this gives us a lot of what we need to look at to see the next step in the evolution. This is the 1980s. Yamaha themselves have designed these 611, 612 instruments throughout the 70s, really improved a lot of things. Some things we'll talk about in a moment. And then in the 80s, they came out with independent bass trombones. The world is moving on. We want instruments that you can use both valves on. I don't know if Olds was a huge factor in that decision. I kind of hope so. I think that horn's really good. It's over there, by the way. Yamaha decided to take steps down that path, and they designed the 613. I think was the first instrument in the independent bass trombone family. The 8130G, of which this kind of is a like further kind of like evolution of that 613 design. And it really shows us how Yamaha was like, all right, how are we going to do this, but just do it better than everyone else on the planet for like 10, 15 years. And basically what they did is they were like, all right, so all the previous improvements, we've got the wide slide. People are kind of used to that. They use narrow slides on some 611 models, maybe even some 613s, I'm not sure. But they kind of standardized on the wide slide with a dual radius crook. Independent valves, we're still using closed wraps. They don't really matter. We're going to talk about that in a bit when we get to open wraps. But the wraps don't make a huge difference. Again, we'll get there. We have independent levers. And then we have modern tapers from here all the way to the end of the bell. We're using Bach-ish dimensions, not exactly, but close enough that it kind of counts. All the Japan model independent bass trombones, as far as I can tell, largely just came with the F slides over here, and G tuning. This is not G, of course, this is G flat. There's something about Japan, they just liked to use G tuning instead of G flat. So a lot of the horns only came with a G slide, including the 8130, and I think probably the 6130, of which this valve section is from. So that might be a step back, except that the 613 also did have a G flat slide. So they were thinking about both different valve tunings. Get more facility with the G valve, but also just get better, easier low range with the G flat valve. The big thing, the really, really big thing about these horns is the valves. We finally have what I would consider to be basically modern valves. If you look at the Yamaha Xeno 830 and 835, these are basically the same valves. The valve caps from any of the modern Yamaha basses will fit on this instrument from the early and mid 80s perfectly. And I haven't taken the valve cores out to check. I should do that because I have access to an 830, and obviously I have access to this. They have not really changed because this design was so far ahead of its time. The Olds we just saw had good valves, but they're very small. The P24 series, again, very good as well, but still kind of an older valve design. They're really just larger in diameter, so they have more room for ports. These have stuff inside them that was actually designed to make the horns play better. Finally, have someone sitting down and being like, how can we make a rotor that is a little more open or gives us the resistance that we want rather than just the resistance we happen to get when we just put a valve on an instrument. They finally sat down and started thinking about that stuff. And this is the result. I would show you the insides, I just don't want to take them apart. But these are so much more modern and easier to play than any of the valves we've seen previously. And not just because they're machined well and stuff, because they are, but because the design of the actual valve interior is just good. It's finally good. We finally have a low C and a low B that kind of match the pedals right next to it. That's the first time. Some of these other instruments, you can get it to sound close maybe, but it's not going to feel close in response almost ever. This finally gets us there. Another huge thing is modern ergonomics, or at least close to it. We still have an underslung valve lever. This is something a lot of companies got away from. I don't mind it personally. It's never really bothered me. Some people hate it. So this is something even Yamaha's gotten away from. But second valve, we even have an adjustable paddle. So you can unscrew this and move this paddle wherever you want, which is huge. On the Olds, nothing is adjustable. You have to get out pliers and like bend stuff around, and like, you know, you can move it, but you can't like adjust it back and forth. So they're really thinking about ergonomics in a way that very few other makers are doing. Bach did have an adjustable finger spatula, is kind of what this is called, on 50 B2s and B3s, I think, at this point. But it's more because they like had to, rather than them really thinking about ergonomics. These are finally, this one is cut. Again, this is a very modified instrument, and it's cut very short. But these are finally not too long. You can play a stock 8130 or 613 or whatever. They're all kind of the same length. You can play them with modern mouthpieces. They're not going to be flat. Finally, somebody is thinking like, you know, there's more mouthpieces than just the 1.5G. Even though in Japan, these are largely played with smaller mouthpieces, they still factor that in. Like, sometimes it's cold, and you got to be able to have enough room to get up to pitch. I'm sure part of it is because in Japan they're using 442 at times in like orchestras and stuff. And again, they're actually thinking about that and not just going, I guess it'll be flat. I guess you need to have it modified after the fact. This one is modified because it had a Bach tuning slide, which, again, too long. So, compromises. What are we compromising now? Now that we've gotten all this cool stuff, there's not a lot of compromises, but there are still some. The low range is much more even than any of our instruments we've seen so far, but it's not perfect. It's not completely just like point and shoot like we can do on a lot of modern instruments. I'll probably talk about this in a later video, but I just got a Shires with rotor valves, and again, I'm always blown away when I get a good Shires bass. I'm like, wow, the low range is even. Like, you just don't think about it. You're like, I'm gonna play a D flat, and D flat comes out. Not to say that playing a D flat on this is difficult, but you can't just like not think about it and just, and a D flat comes out. Just a little more thought still to be made. I think some of that, and we'll talk about the design of this in a second, is due to like the lead pipe, crook, valve, gooseneck. There's some stuff that's not perfectly balanced on these Yamaha basses, and that's one of those things that suffers just a little bit. The strange proprietary linkage design, you know, like this is better than clock spring valves, but it is a little weird. It's got some parts that are kind of just non-replaceable. If these ball joints that attach to the stop arms break, like the whole thing just has to get tossed out. You have to put a whole new one on. And of course, now they don't make any of that stuff. And so, question mark, I guess you're just out of luck. If you got this in Japan, or a lot of American instruments actually, it just came with G tuning. The G flat slides are out there. I've actually owned at least a couple of them, but a lot of them just don't exist. So I've had to make G flat slides for 2 or 3 of these at this point by using Bach 50 parts, which is possible, but again, kind of annoying that you have to do that to get to G flat. These are still designed around smaller mouthpieces. I think especially the 613, 6130, the lower end model, the independent basses with closed wraps, really do play better with smaller mouthpieces. The 8130, so this is an 8130 slide, which is totally different, has different lead pipe, different everything, does play better with larger mouthpieces, but they're still just a little picky. There's a reason I've sold, I guess, 2 8130s. I really liked them, but they're just a little too picky. This is a little better with the Bach bell and Bach tuning slide for me. And this is a complaint about Yamaha's a lot, is the sound just a little bland. And that's a lot of factors, but a lot of that would end up being the bell. As I found out, changing the bells on these makes a huge difference. What's really cool is that we're finally getting to a horn that doesn't have to be modified, even though obviously mine is. I'm showing you one that has a Bach bell tuning slide on it, and it has the wrong slide and a bunch of other stuff. But the stock 8130, even the 613, can be used in like a modern ensemble with no modifications. We're finally getting to an instrument where you're like, yeah, the linkages are good, the valves are good, the slides are good. Like there's just kind of nothing that is just straight up bad about these instruments. So we're finally getting to that point. As we go back in the past, S24G, I wouldn't want to hold that up for a long period of time. Valves are really small. TR-185, I love the sound of it, but with stock linkage, absolutely not. It's horrendous. And if I had anything below the staff, it's just really lacking facility, especially with stock linkage and an E-flat slide on the dependent valve. And we get back to the 70H, oh my God, there's so little that I would actually choose to play on that as stock because you have one valve and it's kind of difficult to play and it's weird tapers. It's just a different design. So we're finally to an instrument where you can just kind of pick it up and be like, sure, would it be the choice I would use for everything necessarily? No, there's horns in the modern age that are better. But we're finally to the point where instruments have caught up, I think. To a point about tapers, obviously this has a Bach 50 tuning slide and bell, but the stock tuning slide and bell are really largely similar in tapers. The tuning slide is a little bit smaller at the small end, exact same size at the big end, and the bells on the stock instruments are 10 inches rather than 9.5, and I think they're probably a tiny bit better, smaller in the throat, kind of this area of the bell. So again, relatively modern tapers and just kind of not weird in any way. On to the final form. Finally, at the good instrument. This is my M&W Bach 50. I mean, it's got a Bach 50 tuning slide and bell, so we're going to call it a Bach 50. Unlike the Yamaha, which had a Bach tuning slide and bell. This is totally different, okay? We're finally in the modern age. These were designed, I'm going to say, late 20-teens. And they incorporate basically everything we've learned about building bass trombones and trombones up until that point. I don't think anything's really changed on these horns since then, but hasn't really had to. So what do we have? We got independent valves, and we got really, really, really good independent valves. In fact, I think they probably incorporate some things we learned from Yamaha on their valves. They're largely based on Greenhoe valves, which I think we all know, but I think those, again, inspired by Yamaha stuff because they were so ahead of the curve. If anyone wants to refute that, go right ahead. I'm probably wrong, but I just have to think that was probably a thing. This has finally the first instrument we've seen with open wraps. Now, why do I say open wraps are kind of a scam? Well, the real reason, at least that I've heard, and I've heard a lot about open wraps, is that Larry Minnick, the famous Southern California brass kind of like maker, fixer, blah, 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 he started doing open wraps on like customer 88Hs, some Bachs, stuff like that, not because they played better, that they were more open, but because they didn't trap any water in them. If you look at a closed wrap, quote unquote, there's a pretty obvious spot where water collects. It's right here. And in fact, this, even though I've played it just a little bit today, probably has some water stuck in there right now. And if you're just like the average trombonist, that's like not a huge deal. But especially if you're playing in a studio that's cooled down to like 64 degrees all the time, that water builds up fast and you need to get rid of it fast. There's no time for you to like pull a slide out, and like do one of these and then put the slide back and then hopefully to the same spot. You just want to have to not deal with that. And so his customers were getting open wraps. And as a side result, perhaps they played better. But again, the way the horns are wrapped, does that affect the airflow? The air is not really traveling through the instrument very fast. You can put like a balloon on the end of the bell. It's not going to fill up very fast when you play because not that much air is actually going through. It's really about the sound path through these tubes is bouncing around and stuff. And so do the turns and stuff in the wraps really matter, or does the bracing and the way that the things are put together matter a lot more? The world will really never know. Honestly, I think open wraps are just kind of overrated, mainly having had closed wrap instruments that are so good. But the modern way to do things is to build open wraps. I think not really because they're just better, but they're just easier to make. This is like fewer parts. There's a lot more straight tubes. It's just kind of an easier thing to do. And we do get wider crooks as tuning crooks as a result. So again, open wraps, yeah, I don't know. They better? I think the valves make much more of a difference. We have an even more adjustable second valve paddle. Instead of just being able to scoot it in and out, I can change everything about its orientation, which makes it a lot easier to adjust. F paddle, it's in the right spot. I don't have to worry about it. It's exactly where I would put it. I just don't need to worry about it. It's very ergonomic. It's not under the thumb, and it has a nice big fat piece to touch when you play it. These are built to a modern length, so they're not too long. Actually, this horn, I think, probably is just a little bit too long with a Bach length slide. I have to push in pretty much all the way. But at least there's some thought put into that. And this is just by far the best playing and the most even of any of the bass trombones that we've seen so far. This has a dual bore slide on it at the moment, and we'll talk about the tapers later. This is quite large through here, but even accounting for those things, this is such an easy instrument to play. That is so even and simple compared to any of the instruments I've already played, including the Yamaha, which again is not bad. I think it's a great instrument. I use it all the time. This is just simply better. It's easier to play. I love it. And we have modern, simple mini ball linkage. There's like kind of just as many moving parts as some of these horns, but it's simple. It's easy to get to. It's easy to maintain. If you need to replace parts, it's just mini ball stuff. Nothing crazy. So compromises. Are there compromises to be made? We're in the modern age. What do we have to compromise on? Yeah, there's a couple things. The biggest one that I can think of is weight. This is also my heaviest bass trombone by a significant amount. I would tell you how much, but it's really hard to weigh bass trombones. There's no like spot you can put a bass trombone down on and just like hold it. Using a bathroom scale is not going to be accurate enough to like the, hundredth of a pound or whatever. And so I can't tell you exactly what these all weigh. Someday I'll get a scale where I can do that. But this is just by far the heaviest bass trombone that I have. It's very balanced. It's back heavy, which is the good kind of heavy, but it's heavier. That's a reason why I will choose my Yamaha sometimes when I know I'm gonna have to hold it up for a long time and I don't need like the best playability. I'm going to choose a different instrument because this is just heavier. And that's just something you got to deal with. And obviously, in today's world, this is a much more expensive instrument than any of the other ones I've shown you so far. I think accounting for inflation, it's probably just about the same as any of these instruments new. I have not gone back and checked on that. I don't have catalogs from the 60s or the 50s. But I think prices have largely kept up with inflation if you're buying them new. But of course, if you're buying this now, the S24G is like $1,000. The 70H is like less than $1,000. This is significantly more than $1,000. So kind of get what you pay for in that regard. But again, going back through the past, I don't think it's really that different. That's pretty much it, though. There are really no other compromises that I can think of. Once you get used to this in this form, playing through a dual bore, there's just kind of no quirks. It just plays. Like, the valve notes sound like slide notes, and they play like slide notes. They respond the same. They sound the same. There's just kind of like nothing given up. Like, there's a difference there. If I really wanted to dial in, you know, maybe I would use sixth position a little bit more. But they feel the same. They feel great. They're even, but they're also not bad. You know, it could be badly even. They're all really bad. And of course, I love the sound of this. I love Bach's. That's why the Yamaha Bach has a Bach bell on it. And this sound, it's just one of the best sounding instruments that I have. I really like it. So, in conclusion, let's wrap all this up with a nice pretty bow. First of all, I'm sorry I didn't play these horns more. I think I left out the 185 almost entirely. I'll probably make a video where I play all 7 of my current bass trombones at some point. It's just really hard to get them all in one spot and record. It takes hours. I don't really have hours these days, so I'm sorry about that. I would love to hear these too. But first question is, was progress worth it, or did we ruin the bass trombone? No, we did not ruin it, and yes, progress was worth it. There's trade-offs, obviously, but this progress would have taken place no matter what. There's not some hidden bass trombone cabal off in the wings, and they're like, all right, let's make bass trombones bigger. Let's make them sound worse, blah, blah, blah. No, this stuff would have happened no matter what, because of the march of the other instruments around us in the orchestra and bands. Things have gotten larger, they've gotten louder. We've taken some of the stuff off the high frequencies in a lot of instruments. We've made them kind of more mellow in a lot of ways. And the bass trombone is just another one of those instruments that has to keep up. There are trade-offs, like I said, that we have made with modern instruments. I think the first one on my list that hopefully is obvious from the recordings that you have heard, both of me in this video and generally throughout history, is color. Color is the biggest thing that I think gets slowly seeped out of instruments as we improve them. This is just a theory of mine, and it is not scientific by any means. And maybe it's not even smart, but I think that when quirks are ironed out in an instrument, the color is one of the first things to also get ironed out that you didn't want to iron out. It's probably a whole video I need to talk about this, but I do feel like when we make instruments easier to play, we trend towards easier to play, the sound is something that kind of goes in the opposite direction. So like right here in the middle, you have a horn that's like okay to play and it sounds pretty good. And maybe you go this way and you have a horn that's like really hard to play and it sounds amazing. It doesn't entirely go this direction, obviously. Really great horns also usually sound really, really good. But if you go the other direction, I feel like if you make a horn that is just perfectly even and perfectly easy to play, they end up sounding kind of boring. My go-to examples are Yamaha and Edwards, which have both really gone far in that direction and actually bounced back a little bit because I think they went a little bit too far. They kind of realized like, oh, if it's perfectly easy and has no quirks, then it also just doesn't sound like anything. Again, massive generalization, and this is my opinion only, but playing through these instruments side by side, I have to note that as I go farther back, the 70H sounds the coolest, has the most going on in its sound. 185 is second best. The Olds is third best. Like, as I move up, they end up sounding a little less colorful and a little less colorful. I still love how this sounds. It's got a great Bach color to it. But if this were a stock Bach 50, maybe just a 50B with a single bore slide, it would probably sound a little better. I would not want to play it. It would be useless, but it would have a sound with more character to it. Something about this modern stuff that does affect the sound. So that's one of the trade-offs. And then again, I talked about that when we talked about the M&W, is weight. Modern instruments are generally, in trombone land anyway, heavier. We've added, I think most importantly, modern valves are all a little larger and incorporate a little more brass and stuff, and that just makes instruments heavier. This also has a bunch of braces on it. It's got some big fancy ferrules. Everything kind of combines to making the horn just heavier. That probably also changes the way the horns sound and respond. It's one of those trade-offs. So color and weight. But other than those two things, generally pretty much everything is improved. Ease of playing. I can play this with any one of my mouthpieces, kind of any time of the week, any time of the day. It's going to be easy to play. The evenness, both in response, or I should say all three things, response, sound, and in dynamics, is by far the best on this instrument. I just kind of really don't have to think about it. It is even. All the things work all the time, rather than me having to go, all right, I'm trying to play in the high register on my 70H. I better do it exactly right or it won't work. No, this is super, super even. Ergonomics have taken a massive forward step thanks to companies like Olds, who kind of got it right, and then Yamaha, who got it mostly right. Now we really don't have to worry about that, along with the advent, of course, of grip aids. Weight distribution has also gotten better in a lot of ways because valve sections have gotten heavier and added valves. Back heavy horns are better. I just straight up, like my 70H, tuning and slide, super long slide, only one valve, and less bell section means that horn is so front heavy, and it is not fun to play for a long period of time. So where does this put vintage bass trombones specifically? Bass trombones in a weird spot with historical bass trombones. I'm saying historical, like anything before this Yamaha I have is basically a historical bass trombone. So many other brass families have almost or completely abandoned their pre-modern designs. Like horns these days, I'm not a super expert on horns, but like the oldest horn designs we use are probably from like the 30s or the 40s, and a lot of things have improved since then. Trumpets are really modern, basically like maybe 40s, 50s, and they don't use anything older than that. The trumpets from before that are really small, just like a different instrument almost. Tubas really moved forward. Not a lot of people playing old designed tubas, maybe like 50s or 60s for those. Yes, there are some instruments out there incorporating like the York bugle, kind of the, the bell and like the major bends and stuff, but we're not playing the original York tubas. There's only like a couple that are worth playing, and they're both at Chicago Symphony. Otherwise, tubas are very modern. They're kind of one of the only instruments that's like similar age as us. And for me, that means I want to modernize, it's a very scary word, a lot of my vintage instruments by adding double valve sections with modern valves. I think every one of my vintage trombones, so the 70H, the 185, and the S24, would all be so cool, easier to play, and just generally better with modern valve sections. I don't think the color would totally disappear. I think they would play better. They'd obviously have more chromatic range, and I would want to get them out more often with modern double valve sections. That doesn't make them useful all the time. It's not like I'm going to pick my double valve 70H out and use it for everything, but it does make it really fun. So overall, progress has moved forward. The bass trombone has changed a lot in the last 70-ish years. And I guess we're talking 70H, almost 100 years. I think 70H came out in the 30s, 90-something years. Bass trombone has moved very far, and the music and the instruments around us have moved very far with it. And I think it's really interesting, and I would love to keep playing these vintage horns in some form or another, which is why I own a bunch of them right now. And hopefully I can make them more modern myself. That's all I got time for. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.